Betsy and Thomas here for the American Intelligence Media. Thomas, I know you and the folks in the conclave have been very busy pulling up some very interesting research, and this audio is going to be attached to the intelligence report that is going to be released, and vice versa. The report is also attached to this audio, so folks can read the article to which you're going to refer. But the purpose of the audio right now is for you to give us a big picture of what you have found, what we're going to look at, and then in the end wrap it up by telling us where we might be going.
Well, Betsy, what we found is institutionalized money laundering. We found cronyism that goes back to the 1700s. We found connections to the British monarchy that are also inside the Bank of England, which are also has tentacles that reach into many companies that are servicing America and, in fact, have almost monopolies in certain sectors of the American markets. And it is just shocking because when we first came across the depth of the senior executive service and saw that there was a shadow government mechanism for this type of cronyism, for this type of basically just a complete ripoff, a theft of American wealth being funneled into foreign countries, into foreign corporations, and no one seeming to notice. We didn't know the depth of it ourselves, and when the senior executive service tool for searching who's an SES member became available by the good work of Leader Technology gnomes, these humans who go down there and hammer out the gold and polish it up and give it over to Betsy, and it gets on Truth News headlines all the time underneath the conclave notes. So what happens is we saw the corruption, and we knew that there was a path. There was a path from the senior executive service to Serco, and we didn't quite know what that meant. And then there was a path on to Crown agents. And so we started looking into this.
And mind you, before you go on, we had seen research that other researchers out there had done on Serco, but we only saw it as a unit, a self-contained unit. We didn't understand the connections it had to these other players.
Well, what we've been doing, as you know, Betsy, all along is taking conspiracy theories, looking into them, seeing if they're true. And if they are, bringing out the evidence to show people, and then making sure that we, make a clear dividing line between conspiracy and reality. So what we heard were these ideas and these directions, and so we started looking into it, and we found the depth of the SES. Many people now in the alternative news have taken it up, and when you say deep state, many people say deep state, and then in parentheses, SES. So it's becoming almost an accepted household term at this point. And many people in the SES are very nervous. We've seen a lot of problems in that group. We've seen people debate this in the alternative news, and it's been very exciting. When we then led our investigation to look at Serco, things got very, very confusing. And so we've been in the mines, we've been doing research with all of our different components, not only the Anonymous Patriots and doing this intelligence report, but also with Leader Technologies and Michael McKibben and his team and all these people working together to find out the depth of this. And it's astounding the amount of information that has come forth. Just amazing. We want to thank all those people who've pulled up FOIA documents, who've pulled up government documents for us to look at and to add to our evidence and add to the crime line or the timeline of the Americans for Innovation timeline, which you could go look at and plug in anybody's name, and if they're a criminal, it's going to come up on that crime line if they're a Washington, D.C. criminal, in most cases. So what we found with Serco was very odd. We found that Serco has been bounced back and forth in America as a monopoly in America and as a monopoly in Britain. And we looked first into the abuses of Serco in Britain, where they say that they've basically mismanaged and stolen $80 billion. Serco is called the company, the biggest company you've never heard anything about, or you've never heard of. And it basically controls the data management and all kinds of services, from nuclear services and nuclear power plants to schools in Britain and Australia and Canada and New Zealand and in America, and many, many, many other places. So throughout the world, Serco just has a huge, huge web. and there's a Serco America. Now, Serco America was very, very strange founding. It goes back to, I don't want to get too detailed with this, but it goes back to a company called Radio Corporation of America, the RCA. Most of us remember RCA Victrola with the dog sitting, listening to the first gramophones. And they actually had a monopoly. They had a huge monopoly with the government, and they had to be broken up as a monopoly. And then General Electric bought them. Well, General Electric was a monopoly. And Bell Laboratory, and then AT&T, all these companies to begin with, right after World War I, became fantastic monopolies. Standard Oil, some of them had to be broken into pieces. So GE broke into pieces and sold off RCA, and then part of it, the Serco division for Britain, then came into the hands of two knights of Queen Elizabeth II. And they basically are what we now know are called crown agents. A crown agent, it could be considered a dirty term in the ancient days, in the 1700s, because they were the ones who controlled colonial life. They were higher than anyone. They controlled the supply line, they controlled the economics, they controlled the taxes, and they controlled any corporations. So the British in the northern part of America, of the 13 colonies, and the British East India Company, and then the Dutch East India Company in the southern part, bringing slaves over and taking back resources, and then, of course, the British in the north. So it started back in the 1700s that the British crown agents were incredibly powerful. And it's very hard to separate the Queen out from the Bank of England. So when you look into this, you have to be very, very careful. So when I say sometimes crown agents, that is a generalized term for companies that might have been monopolies, still connected to England, and certainly, definitely still connected to the crown.
But these crown agents were here embedded all throughout America in the 1700s, correct?
Yes.
And so they just didn't pack up and go away. They just became more cunning, and they got into the tentacles of how we operate in America, from our businesses to our government, and they've never left, have they?
No, they haven't.
And because they write and publish the history books and the media, they can keep this important information away from the average citizen. So we go around waving our flag and going through elections and doing all this, when all the while the Queen is running America.
The British Crown and the Dutch are still, to this moment, the Dutch, through a company called CT Corporations, which we're going to be talking about in the future, holds basically the corporation papers for anyone in the West who wants to do business. One person, Walter Kloers. Amazing. A Dutch company. Isn't that an amazing thing? All the corporations in America pay a due to a company in Holland. So when you go back to the Queen and you say the Crown, let's get specific about that. So GE has many military contracts. They're huge. They're practically a monopoly in the early days in electronic warfare in the 70s and 80s, when I was particularly involved with it. But they still, to this very day, are incredibly powerful, and people don't know that they own a huge portion of Lockheed Martin, which has the largest intelligence agency in America, a corporate intelligence agency, and has ripped off the government, the Pentagon, for more money than anybody knows. And that's who we're dealing with. GE is Lockheed in a way, but they are in everything. So when they were in England, they not only set up the nuclear plants there in a company called AWE, Atomic Weapons Establishment, I believe it's called, and GE and a company called Serco were part of that. Well, Serco, when it was in England, was very powerful. They took over when GE was broken up, and their section in England became Serco. But before they came back to America, there are certain companies that just started buying all the tech companies, and another company that started buying all the data management companies, and another company who handled infrastructure data management for airports, for flight control towers, for everything from parking meters to buses, to the schedules for buses, to visa, to immigration. You cannot do anything practically in your life that you do not have Serco handling part of the management of the data of your life. So when Serco came to America, they bought up 3 companies, a company RCI, and that was a huge infrastructure management company. Then they bought up a company called SI International, and it was this gigantic data management company. And then they bought up a company called CACI, which had bought up about 20 tech companies. So when the Queen's 2 knighted Crown agents from Serco came to America to start a supposed American version of Serco USA, they bought up all these companies with $450 million from a Cayman Island account. Oh, isn't that clever? Of course, the offshore accounts on the British, 53 Commonwealth nations, part of the British Kingdom, the United Kingdom, many are islands that are offshore accounts and tax havens which have these fake dummy companies in them, which we're going to be revealing more and more of. You've seen this in the Panama Papers and other times that you've seen these releases. So that goes again back to the Crown of England. So Serco, when it came here, basically took over the management of our sensitive information for the Department of Defense, for everyone. For the government, for corporations, you name it, municipalities, cities, everyone.
But of course they would, because it's senior executive service employees that are largely deciding where these contracts go. And because they're part of this whole network of how the British Crown really runs us. So you've got your SES employees, they're embedded everywhere. You know, they got that kind of funky training they've got going at that institute. I mean, it's just weird that these people, and the links are below if you want to read more about it. But then they award the contracts to Serco, and you and your team are going to show us how Serco is totally, irrefutably tied to the British Crown.
The Senior Executive Association is a union of members of the Senior Executive Service, which has many names. And those good folks are 10,000 strong, and they are the shadow government that makes sure that the bids always go to the same people, that it always goes to the same crony group of capitalists.
Well, why would you call them good people?
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called them good people. There might be good people there, but they don't do good things because what they're doing is selling out America. They're a parasite on America. When anyone looks at what we're about to show in this intelligence report, you will go, wait a second, wait, why would we do that? How can this be possible? Well, we've discovered the mechanism. No one would have believed a false flag was legal until we discovered the mechanism found in the National Defense Authorization Act, changed in 2012 by Obama. No one could believe what we're saying until we show you the proof that this is an institutionalized mechanism that has been going on for a very long time, and we show you that it is SES members that are doing this. And when you see the crimes going on in D.C., it's just plug it in. They're usually SES members who have incredibly large pay, wonderful retirement. They can barely be fired, and they basically just follow whatever the Senior Executive Association tells them to do. It's like a union. So what we want to point out is that Serco is not the only company doing this. We can go into great detail, and we have, and in the future we're going to be giving many, many more details on this. But we can also point out a company that's a British-owned company that goes right back to being owned by the United Kingdom, Dutch companies, and German companies. It's a company called Urenco, which controls the uranium enrichment, diffusion uranium enrichment in Eunice, New Mexico. They said they'd build the plant for $1 billion. Well, then they got $2 billion from us, taxpayers. So we paid for 2/3 of it, but now Britain, Holland, and Germany are benefiting from the uranium that, by the way, huge amounts of uranium the Queen already owned, literally the Queen owned through a company called Rio Tinto. And the Queen has the golden shares in Rio Tinto, so she owns it outright, which means it's also then part of the Bank of England. So it's all interwoven. There's a law in England that says you cannot question any of the business of any of the monarchy. So no one can know what the Queen is up to. I know it sounds crazy, but we're showing you the proof in this intelligence report. Plus, if you study these things, you can find that it's quite commonly known. So the uranium was coming up from Rio Tinto. It was going to New Mexico. It was being enriched, and then she was taking it out of the country to places like Syria, which Israel had to bomb. taken out to places like Iran, to North Korea, to Russia, all over the place, and many other places in the East. And so the Queen somehow has the rights to ship this enriched uranium, not only to our own nuclear power plants here, just as the Russians, through their megaton to megawatt program, which we've discussed many a time, they were also they were in a battle for the uranium market in America. And that's what the Uranium One was all about. It was a battle between this organization called Urenco and an organization called TENAM. And that's why there was all the money laundering and the extortion and the theft and the so on and so forth. Because there was a battle. Because uranium's on its way out. It's going to be replaced by thorium in the next 10 years. That's a guarantee. All uranium nuclear power plants can be retrofitted for thorium. So it's on its way out. But Urenco is a huge company that makes huge money in America. Why aren't Americans doing this? Why are we getting Russian uranium? We have tons of uranium from our missiles that we can just take and downblend it and use it instead of the Russians doing it here in America for us. It makes no sense. Why do we let British Petroleum have multiple contracts in offshore drilling when they've proven themselves to be criminally negligent with the BP Deepwater accident, which has never been cleaned up, and all they did was pay a small fine, nothing compared to the money that they've ripped off from United States of American oil reserves and oil resources? Why are we letting BP drill in Alaska? And then the other company, Dutch Shell Oil, well, that's actually British. So when you say Shell or Amoco, or when you say BP, that's British Petroleum, it all goes back to the same group of people. These are Crown agents working directly for the Queen, and they're taking huge amounts of money out of America. They have more gas stations than even our own Standard Oil or Chevron. This is ridiculous. We were the king of Standard Oil's monopoly in America, and now we let the British take our oil and literally give us our gas stations? How does this happen? SES. These are huge contracts, federal municipal contracts, just like Serco. Urenco, same thing. BP, same thing. Shell Oil, same thing. A company called CGI that manages, that was the company we paid $2 billion to get the Obamacare webpage started. It's a Canadian company. It's the largest data management company in Canada. Well, when you say Canada, you say the Commonwealth. And when you say the Commonwealth, the Queen has a piece of all of it. So we're not exaggerating. So when they say the Queen is this filthy rich person and her family's filthy rich, well, that's true. But now let's get down to the details. So then we break it down. We show you that British American tobacco, they're the only thing American is we grow the tobacco here. The Brits take it, $46 billion industry a year, kills a minimum of 6 million people worldwide directly attributable to it. The number is probably 5 times greater than that. And so they're killing millions of people a year because they took over American tobacco. When did that happen? When did R.J. Reynolds become BAT? Nobody seems to notice these things. When did the largest interdealer banking corporation in the world, IDP, was taken over by a British company? They do trillions of dollars of business a year. So we stacked up a bunch of these to show you. We're not exaggerating. But the one that really gets to you, the one that really made our investigators get really upset with this, and they would get mad and they would throw things because they looked at the Crown Agents. It's called Crown Agents USA Incorporated. And they looked at what they do. There's a group called the United States USAID, for International Development. United States Agency for International Development. Is what it's called. They give away $27 billion a year. Well, Crown agents come over and they stand in the middle and they take this money that is given away
by the U.S. government,
by the US
taxpayers,
and they just basically absorb it, and then they spend it in third world countries in companies that they own. So if you look at the ownership of the Crown Agents USA Incorporated, they own all this stuff in Africa. And then what do? They stand and they receive aid money from America, and they give it to their own companies ultimately in Africa, but they launder it through American companies, Wells Fargo, Citibank. We're going to show you this, where it's stacked up. They give away trillions of dollars, and the company is completely a fraud. They say they started with $126 million, and they now, in just a decade, manage $80 billion. Not possible.
So this aid is never getting to the people it's intended to get to.
Obviously not, because if you started with $126 million and $8 billion in backing, see what this company is it's a backing for bankers so that they can't lose. And so the USAID gives to Crown agents, but then there's the OPIC, and that's the really big criminal
don't go
one.
there in this one.
I got to.
Just a little bit then.
Got to. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation is basically a corporate global arm of the USAID, and the Royal Crown Agents, USA Incorporated, and other British companies stand there and just receive the money, and it disappears. They build things in places literally in Mongolia, or they give loans to banks to give loans, but then there's no follow through. So who would know whether they gave anybody a loan? So let me just give you one example of how this works.
It's kind of like a risk insurance program.
Yes, to make sure that no banker, no hedge fund
Ever has exposure.
never has any exposure.
Because the U.S. taxpayers always got your back, but we don't know it.
And in some cases, it just goes to individuals who just simply absorb the money. And we're talking, I don't want to misquote the number.
Well, don't go there.
It's at least 800
It's in the article.
billion.
I have the article attached.
In a year. They now move huge amounts of money. One example, we, United States of American taxpayers, gave in 2017 to a company called Noble Oil, which is one of these companies that owns Royal Crown USA Incorporated, but that's neither here nor there. We gave to Noble Oil $1.4 billion to drill for oil in Israel. And the year before, we paid $400 million to drill in Jordan and Israel. And that's just the 2 years I checked. So if we look, we're going to find that U.S. taxpayers are paying billions of dollars in loans and in guarantees to drill the oil that when it comes up, we don't get anything paid back. A private corporation, if any money is actually ever made, goes back to the private corporation. So we spend $88 million a year to run the OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and we give $20 million or more. We just throw money at them, but it doesn't really matter because we're given $27 billion, and Israel receives billions of dollars in aid, and then they receive billions of dollars in these fake corporate schemes, which are simply bank schemes to rip off America and to use the United States government as the insurance agency. They even pay hedge funds to insure against political instability.
Well, that's all. We're going to be talking about that with OPIC, but we are trying not to overwhelm everyone. We're just trying to go step by step so that it doesn't look too unapproachable. So is there anything else we need to talk about with just the general overview of this before we in this particular audio?
No, what we have pointed out, what we want to stick to is the list that has been made. We want to bring attention to the fact that so much of this can be ended by simply having President Trump sign a check to Leader Technologies and end Silicon Valley's monopolies, because this is all about monopolies. And then you need to remember, if you want to understand this, that you go from the senior executive service to companies like Serco and all the ones we've listed, and you go from huge aid agencies, United States aid agencies like USAID
and OPIC
and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and many others, all the refugee funds, huge amounts of United Nations, billions of dollars to the United Nations, all flow through these same channels. And these channels go back to before America was America.
But my goodness, we could stop the flow. We might be able to pay off the debt in a couple of years.
None of this money should be leaving this country. Americans can do all this work. We do not need to give it to Crown agents. We do not need to give the Queen her golden share. We don't need to give that money to these fake organizations to spend it in third world countries on things that we never know are whether they even get built or not. So As you said from the beginning, I'm not sure we won the first American Revolution.